"I'm taking half your millions," Adrian whispered across the courtroom, loud enough for me to hear. Then his mouth curled into that confident little smile I'd learned to hate. "Including your grandmother's estate." I stared at the man I'd been married to for 9 years. His attorney had just spent nearly 20 minutes explaining why Adrian supposedly deserved a piece of almost everything attached to my name. The company I'd built, my investments, even the property my grandmother Evelyn had entrusted to me before she died. Adrian leaned back in his chair like the hearing was already over. Behind him, one of his friends murmured, "Congratulations," before the judge had ruled on anything. I looked down at the document case beside my chair. Adrian thought he'd found the weakness in my finances. For months, he'd warned me that marriage had consequences. "You're going to learn what marriage actually costs," he'd told me. Maybe he was right. Just not in the way he expected. His attorney continued. "Mrs. Bennett routinely used distributions connected to her business to support the marital household. Those transactions demonstrate that the financial separation she now claims was not nearly as clear as she would have this court believe." My attorney, Rachel Kim, shifted beside me. I kept my hands still, although that argument frightened me more than I wanted Adrian to know. My company shares and investments were worth several $1,000,000. I had founded the financial software business before our marriage, long before Adrian started introducing himself at parties as if we'd built it together. But Evelyn's estate was different. The lakeside property, investment accounts, and family assets weren't simply money to me. My grandmother had spent decades building them, and when she left them in my care, I understood what that meant. Adrian hadn't cared about the lake house when Evelyn was alive. Now that it was valuable, suddenly he believed half belonged to him. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Counsel," he said, looking toward Rachel, "does your client dispute Mr. Bennett's characterization of these assets?" Rachel started to rise. I touched her arm. "Wait." Across the aisle, Adrian glanced at me. I opened my document case and removed one sealed envelope. His smile disappeared. That was the first crack. I stood, carried the envelope forward, and handed it to the clerk. "Your Honor," I said, "before you decide anything, please check again." The envelope reached the judge. Adrian leaned toward his attorney and whispered something urgently. The judge opened it. He pulled out the first document. His eyes moved down the page, then stopped. He looked at the final section, at a signature. When he raised his head, he wasn't looking at me. He was staring directly at Adrian. And for the first time that morning, my husband looked genuinely afraid. Because the signature at the bottom of that page was his. So why was the man demanding half my fortune suddenly terrified of something he'd signed himself? 3 months earlier, Adrian had been standing in our kitchen when I finally said the words I'd avoided for too long. "I want a divorce." He didn't shout. That almost made it worse. He slowly set his coffee cup on the counter and studied me as if I'd just made a business proposal he was considering. "Okay," he said. I hadn't expected that. For years, every disagreement about money had become a negotiation. Adrian questioned purchases I made with my own earnings, complained whenever I reinvested money into my company, and constantly referred to everything I owned as asterisk or as asterisk. But now he seemed almost relaxed. Then he asked, "You don't actually think you're walking away with all that money, do you?" There it was. I folded my arms. "I want this to be fair, Adrian. I'm not interested in turning our divorce into a financial war." He gave a quiet laugh. "Fair means half. Half of what we built during the marriage." "No," he stepped closer, "half." Then he named the one asset that made my stomach tighten. "And Evelyn's lake house." I stared at him. My grandmother had died 2 years earlier. Adrian had never cared about her property beyond asking whether we might spend occasional weekends there. Then its valuation increased dramatically. Suddenly, he had opinions about it. That was my grandmother's estate, I said. She left it to me. My lawyer disagrees. Your lawyer thinks you're entitled to my grandmother's inheritance. Adrian picked up his coffee. You should probably get your own lawyer and find out. A few days later, I did. And that's when I realized his threat wasn't empty. Rachel Kim placed Adrian's formal financial demands across her desk. He's claiming an interest in marital savings, she said. That's expected. She turned the page. But he's also asserting claims involving your company and inherited assets. My company existed before I married him. That matters, so does the inheritance, but we need clean documentation. Rachel pulled several statements toward her. These concern me. I recognized the transactions immediately. During our marriage, I'd sometimes use distributions connected to my business to cover household expenses, mortgage payments, renovations, vacations, the lifestyle Adrian enjoyed without asking where the money came from. Rachel tapped the statements. Separate property can be protected, but how money is handled matters. Adrian's attorneys are going to argue that the boundaries became blurred. For the first time, I wondered whether my own generosity had created his opening. That night, I went through the financial cabinet in my home office. Tax records, corporate documents, bank statements. Then I reached the drawer containing records from the year Adrian, and I married. I froze. One entire file was missing. 2 days later, Adrian returned to collect more of his belongings. I stood in the doorway, holding the empty folder. Where are the documents that were in here? He glanced at it. What documents? The records from the year we got married. He kept packing. Maybe you misplaced them. Adrian. He stopped. I had spent 9 years learning his expressions, and the tiny smile that appeared told me more than any confession could have. You know exactly what I'm talking about. He walked past me toward the hallway, then stopped beside the filing cabinet. Adrian reached out, tapped the empty drawer twice, and smiled. You should have kept better records. I learned Adrian wasn't just fighting me in court when I walked into a mutual friend's birthday dinner, and the conversation stopped. Not faded. Stopped. 6 people looked at me, then quickly looked away. I hadn't even reached the table when Claire, an old friend of ours, stood and gave me an awkward hug. Mercy, I didn't know things had gotten this bad. I pulled back. What exactly did Adrian tell you? Her expression answered before she did. At the table, another friend finally said, He told us you're trying to leave him with nothing. I stared at him. Nothing. He said you're claiming everything belongs to you because your name is on it. Then came the question Adrian had apparently prepared everyone to ask. You have millions, Mercy. Why fight him over his fair share? Before I could answer, someone behind me spoke. Exactly. Adrian. He walked toward the table like he'd been waiting for the perfect entrance. She thinks because her name is on everything, none of it belongs to me. Several people shifted uncomfortably. I'm not discussing our finances at someone's birthday dinner, I said. Adrian smiled. See. My silence had become evidence. Then he pulled out his phone. My attorneys already found transactions from her business accounts during our marriage. My stomach tightened. Adrian, stop. Why, it's true. He showed the screen to the people nearest him. I recognized the statements. Household payments, renovation expenses, transfers covering vacations and other costs. They were real. And suddenly, his confidence made more sense. I left without defending myself. Later that night, Rachel and I examined the same records in her office. She moved through them slowly until she stopped. Mercy. What? She arranged several pages by date. Look where his evidence begins. I leaned closer. Several months after our wedding. Rachel pointed at the gap. He has plenty of records showing what happened afterward, but nothing showing how ownership was defined immediately before you married. And then I remembered. My grandmother, Evelyn. Weeks before my wedding, she'd insisted Adrian and I meet with her estate attorney. I'd been embarrassed by it at the time. Grandma, we're getting married, not merging corporations. Evelyn hadn't laughed. Love is emotional, she'd told me. Documents shouldn't be. I hadn't thought about that meeting in years. The next morning, I called Evelyn's retired estate attorney. When I gave him my name, he remembered me immediately. Yes, he said, and I remember Adrian. My grip tightened around the phone. Do you still have the file from our meeting? A pause. I believe it's in the archive. I stood from my chair. What exactly did Adrian sign that day? There was another silence as he checked his records. Then his voice changed. Mercy, your husband knew exactly what he was agreeing to. Rachel didn't smile when she saw the archived documents. She read them twice. Then she pushed the first page across her desk toward me. Your company. I looked down. The document formally identified my ownership, interest in the business, as property I held before marrying Adrian. Rachel placed another document beside it. And this concerns Evelyn's estate plan. My grandmother had gone further than I'd remembered. Anything I later inherited through her estate had been structured to pass to me separately. But neither document was what made Rachel sit back in her chair. It was the third one. Look at the bottom. I did. Adrian Bennett. His signature. His initials appeared beside multiple sections, confirming that he'd received notice of the arrangements and acknowledged he had no ownership interest in those assets. I stared at the page. So he knew. He knew. Suddenly, the missing records made sense. The financial statements Adrian had produced began after our wedding, because the earlier documents destroyed the story he was telling. Rachel raised a hand before I could celebrate. Don't misunderstand this. We still have marital assets to divide. Income and property accumulated during the marriage will have to be addressed. Good. She looked at me. I mean it, Rachel. If something legitimately belongs to both of us, Adrian gets his share. I tapped his signature. But he doesn't get to turn everything I've ever owned into marital property because he wants it now. Then we're on the same page. Rachel compared the archived documents against Adrian's financial disclosures. Minutes later, she stopped again. You need to see this. In an earlier sworn financial filing, Adrian himself had described my company interest and Evelyn's inheritance as separate assets. When that classification benefited him, he'd acknowledged it. Now he was telling the court the opposite. Rachel obtained certified copies. I placed the most important originals and acknowledgments into a single envelope. And that envelope came with me to court. Back at the hearing, Adrian sat confidently on the witness stand. I always understood our finances to be shared, he testified. Mercy never treated her wealth as separate during our marriage. Rachel stood. Mr. Bennett, do you remember meeting with Evelyn's estate attorney shortly before your wedding? Adrian's confidence flickered. It's been 9 years. That wasn't my question. He glanced toward his attorney. I remember attending some meeting. Rachel looked at me. That was my cue. The envelope went forward. The judge removed Adrian's signed acknowledgement first. Then Rachel directed him to Adrian's earlier sworn disclosure. The judge placed them side by side. Adrian's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, perhaps a brief recess would allow us to. No. The courtroom went silent. The judge looked over his glasses at Adrian. No, I'd like Mr. Bennett to explain this first. The judge placed Adrian's signed acknowledgement beside the financial claim his attorneys had filed in our divorce. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Adrian shifted in the witness chair. The judge tapped the first document. Mr. Bennett, this bears your signature. Adrian leaned forward. It appears to. His attorney stood. Your Honor. I'm asking Mr. Bennett. Adrian swallowed. Yes, that's my signature. The judge turned to the next page. The documents were painfully clear now. Before our marriage, my ownership interest in my company had been formally identified as mine. My grandmother Evelyn had separately structured her estate so that anything I later inherited from her would pass to me individually. And Adrian hadn't merely been told about those arrangements. He had acknowledged them in writing. The judge looked at him. You're now claiming you understood Mrs. Bennett's company interest and inherited a estate to belong equally to both of you. Adrian hesitated. That was how our marriage worked financially. Rachel rose. Your Honor, the later transactions Mr. Bennett relies upon show household expenditures and marital income. We aren't disputing legitimate marital property. What we dispute is his attempt to use those transactions to claim ownership of underlying assets he previously acknowledged were separate. The judge glanced again at Adrian's earlier financial disclosure. There was the second problem. When it had benefited Adrian in that earlier filing, he described my company interest and Evelyn's inheritance as separate assets himself. Now he wanted the same assets classified differently. The judge lifted the acknowledgement. Why did you sign this? Adrian's face tightened. I don't remember every document I signed 9 years ago. You initialed several provisions. I trusted what was put in front of me. The judge looked down. This section states that you were advised of your right to obtain independent legal advice. Adrian said nothing. The judge continued. And there are your initials. A whisper moved through the courtroom. Behind Adrian, the relatives who'd spent the morning confidently watching me suddenly went quiet. Then Adrian made the mistake that finished whatever credibility he had left. He leaned forward. But I'm still her husband. I'm entitled to half of everything. The judge stared at him, then at the document, then back at him. A short, incredulous laugh escaped him. Mr. Bennett, marriage is not a deed transferring ownership of everything your spouse already owns. Adrian's face went rigid. Nobody behind him was congratulating him anymore. The friend who'd done exactly that earlier lowered his eyes. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. For months, Adrian had tried to make me feel greedy for protecting what belonged to me. He'd told friends I was leaving him with nothing. He'd presented selected financial records as though paying for our life together somehow meant he'd acquired ownership of everything behind those payments. Now his own signature was sitting in front of the judge. And it said otherwise. The court still treated our actual marital property fairly. The savings we'd accumulated together were addressed. Financial obligations, genuinely created during our marriage, remained part of the divorce. I wasn't allowed to call everything mine simply because I'd earned more money. I hadn't asked for that. But Adrian wasn't allowed to do the reverse either. My documented premarital company ownership remained protected. Evelyn's separately maintained inheritance remained mine. The lake house remained part of the estate my grandmother had entrusted to me. And Adrian's attempt to stretch legitimate marital claims into half of my entire fortune failed. His contradictory financial disclosures caused another problem. The judge became far more skeptical whenever Adrian made claims that weren't backed by records. By the time we walked out of court, the swagger was gone. Adrian caught up with me in the hallway. Mercy. I kept walking. He stepped in front of me. You set me up. Rachel stopped beside me, but I shook my head slightly. I could answer this myself. You think I set you up? You kept that envelope until today. Yes. You knew what was inside. Eventually. His jaw tightened. You made me look like a liar. For 9 years, my instinct had been to soften moments like that, keep the peace, Avoid embarrassing him. Find the version of my answer that would hurt the least. I wasn't doing that anymore. I didn't write those documents, Adrian. He stared at me. I continued. You signed them. He had no answer. And after court, the story he'd been telling everyone began collapsing too. Our mutual friends learned that I had never tried to deny Adrian his lawful share of what we'd genuinely accumulated during our marriage. I'd agreed to divide legitimate marital property. What I refused to do was surrender my premarital company ownership and my grandmother's inheritance, because Adrian had decided that marrying me made him entitled to them. Several people who'd supported him quietly distanced themselves. I stopped chasing anyone for an apology. The records had already said everything I needed them to say. When the divorce was finalized, Adrian left with his lawful share of what we'd actually built together. He did not leave with half my company. He did not leave with half my grandmother's estate. And he did not leave with the fortune he'd tried to claim through intimidation. For a while, I moved into Evelyn's lakeside house. One morning, I walked into the garden she'd loved and found it overgrown from months of neglect. So I started restoring it. Not because I needed another property. Because I finally understood what my grandmother had tried to teach me years earlier. Protecting something doesn't make you selfish. And keeping the peace isn't always the same thing as being kind. I kept that courtroom envelope afterward. Not framed. Not displayed. Just stored safely with my important documents. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. Fairness had never required me to surrender. Adrian entered that courtroom laughing because he thought marriage entitled him to my fortune. He left knowing his own signature had proved otherwise.